Hit a certain number in a brokerage account, and the rest of your life takes care of itself. That is the fundamental promise of the early retirement movement. Cross the finish line. The 25 times multiplier, the freedom number, the magic portfolio target, and the math becomes a kind of shield. But there is a reason people who reach that number still feel a quiet, persistent anxiety. It isn't because they saved the wrong amount. It's because hitting the number is a milestone of accumulation, not a guarantee of resilience. Early retirement isn't fragile because markets are volatile. It's fragile because of structural blind spots that most people only notice after they've already handed in their resignation. Some early retirees don't fail because they didn't save enough. They fail because of decisions they didn't see coming. If you're watching this, you probably know your net worth to the penny. Summer, you've modeled withdrawal rates. You've visualized what that first Tuesday morning of total freedom feels like. No calendar, no obligations, nowhere to be. And somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a quiet question that the spreadsheet hasn't answered. What if I'm missing something? That feeling isn't irrational. It's actually useful information. Because most early retirement plans don't collapse from catastrophic market events. They erode from small, compounding errors in judgment, decisions that felt completely logical during the accumulation phase and became quietly toxic once the paycheck stopped. There are 5 specific mistakes that appear most often in early retirement plans. Not rare edge cases, structural errors that careful, disciplined planners still make. One of them, mistake number 3, is the one most FIRE discussions underestimate. We'll get there. But first, you need to dismantle a belief that almost everyone in this space carries. There is a deeply held assumption that once you hit your FIRE number, retirement becomes simple math. You pull 4%, the market returns 7%, the gap is your safety margin, and the system runs itself. The problem is that a portfolio target is a static snapshot of a dynamic future. Retirement isn't a destination you reach. It's a system you have to manage. And the rules of the accumulation phase are not the rules of the distribution phase. They require completely different thinking. And confusing the two is where the trouble starts. Most people don't discover that distinction until after they've stopped working, when the income is gone, when the market moves differently than the model assumed, when life introduces variables that no spreadsheet anticipated. Early retirement is less about how much you saved and more about how you've engineered the system to absorb what you didn't see coming. And mistake number 2 involves a specific market scenario that most plans quietly ignore. Mistake number 1 is lifestyle drift. When you're working, your expenses are partially defined by your professional environment. When you retire early, that environment disappears, and a vacuum opens up. Many planners calculate their FIRE number based on current spending. If they live on $50,000 a year now, the model assumes $50,000 a year at 45. But early retirement reallocates roughly 2,000 hours of work time every single year. That time gets filled with travel, hobbies, projects, experiences, none of it reckless, all of it reasonable, and together it gradually shifts your spending baseline in ways that compound across a 30-year retirement. The issue isn't that spending increases. The issue is when the plan assumed it wouldn't. Lifestyle drift doesn't look like a mistake while it's happening. It looks like a series of perfectly reasonable decisions. That's what makes it dangerous. Mistake number 2 is sequence of returns risk. This is the problem that keeps professional planners awake. And it's the one most DIY retirement plans underestimate most severely. Most people focus on their average return over 30 years, but in early retirement, the order of those returns matters more than the average. If the market drops significantly in your first 2 years, while you're also withdrawing money to live, you're selling assets at depressed prices to cover expenses. You're locking in losses at the worst possible moment, and you're shrinking the base that needs to recover. A portfolio can absorb a crash in year 15, it often cannot absorb a crash in year one. Think of it this way. You wouldn't cross a river that is, on average, 4 feet deep if you knew the middle was 8. The average doesn't protect you from where you're actually standing. Relying on average returns without a sequence buffer isn't a conservative plan. It's an optimistic one dressed up in historical data. Mistake number 3 is overconfidence in the 4% rule. This is the one most FIRE discussions underestimate, and it requires a level of honesty that can feel uncomfortable. The 4% rule was developed for traditional 30-year retirements. It was derived from historical U.S. market data, under specific conditions, during a specific period of market history. If you retire at 40, you're potentially looking at a 50 or 60-year horizon. Research on longer retirements suggests a more conservative rate, closer to 3% or 3.25%, may be more appropriate depending on conditions. The difference between 4% and 3.5% sounds small. Over a 50-year retirement, it isn't small. It can be the difference between a portfolio that compounds quietly in the background and one that runs dry at 75. Treating the 4% rule as a fixed ceiling rather than a flexible starting point is where the error lives. Financial independence is built on flexibility, not rigid adherence to a single guideline built for a different kind of retirement than yours. Here is where the conversation changes. Most people assume the biggest threats to early retirement live in their brokerage account. Market crashes, inflation, interest rates. But as you move closer to your date, a different category of risk starts to surface. One that has nothing to do with finance. Mistake number 4 is psychological misalignment. We spend years, sometimes decades, treating work as the obstacle between us and the life we actually want. The logical conclusion is that removing the obstacle creates the life. Oh, it's more complicated than that. Many early retirees experience a significant identity disruption within the first 6 months. Work provides more than income. It provides structure, social connection, a sense of purpose, and a clear answer to the question, what am I doing today? When those disappear simultaneously, even by choice, the adjustment can be sharper than expected. Without a clear sense of what you're moving toward, rather than just what you're moving away from, retirement can feel like a problem to solve rather than a life to inhabit. And that psychological discomfort has financial consequences. Erratic decisions. Unretiring at the wrong moment. Spending to fill boredom that was never accounted for in the model. The people who navigate this well tend to have built a life architecture alongside the financial architecture before the last day of work, not after. Mistake number 5 is underestimating healthcare and longevity costs. Retiring at 40 or 45 means potentially 45 or 50 years outside of employer-sponsored benefits. In your 30s, healthcare is often a line item someone else manages. In your 50s and 60s, it becomes a variable, escalating expense that is genuinely difficult to model. And the longevity tail, the real possibility of living to 90 or 95 and what that costs, rarely appears in early retirement spreadsheets with the weight it deserves. A plan built for a healthy 45-year-old may not hold for an 85-year-old navigating the realities of modern medical care. Without a dedicated healthcare strategy and a realistic buffer for later life costs, the plan has a structural gap, regardless of how well everything else is designed. Here's the reframe that holds all of this together. The safest early retirement plans aren't the biggest. They're the most flexible. Resilient planners don't just have a number. They have variable withdrawal strategies, the ability to spend modestly less when the market is down and adjust back when it recovers. They hold 1 to 2 years of expenses in low volatility assets, so they're never forced to sell into a downturn to cover rent. They've built a life they actually want to inhabit, so retirement doesn't become an expensive search for meaning. Early retirement is not a one-time calculation. It is an ongoing relationship between your capital, your time, and the uncertainty you can't predict. When you stop treating retirement as a finish line and start treating it as a system built for uncertainty, something shifts. The anxiety doesn't disappear. It converts into something more useful: quiet preparation, structural thinking, confidence that isn't dependent on the market cooperating. You don't need a perfect plan. You need an adaptive one. The most durable retirements aren't built by the people who saved the most. They're built by the people who thought most carefully about what comes after the number and designed something flexible enough to hold. Financial independence is built on flexibility. That's not just a principle for the portfolio. It's the architecture of the whole thing.